Ivanka. By Ivanka T. Chapter 1, The Daughter of Destiny. I was born into privilege, though I didn't understand what that truly meant until much later. My name is Ivanka Trench, daughter of Draco Trench, the man who would become the most powerful person in the United Country. This is my story, unfiltered, unvarnished, and unapologetic. The marble floors of Trench Tower always felt cold beneath my feet, even in summer. As a child, I would slide across them in my socks, pretending I was ice skating, much to the dismay of our household staff. My father would laugh when he caught me, his booming voice echoing through the cavernous penthouse. "That's my girl," he'd say, eyes twinkling with that mixture of pride and calculation I'd come to recognize as his signature expression. Always finding a way to make the most of what you've got. Making the most of what I had was never the problem. I had everything: designer clothes, elite education, and the Trench name. What I lacked was something far more precious: a mother's love. My biological mother, Ivana, had left when I was just 8 years old, driven away by my father's relentless ambition and wandering affections. The divorce was splashed across every tabloid in the country, turning our family pain into public entertainment. I remember sitting in my bedroom, doors locked, reading headlines about my parents that no child should ever have to see. My father's response was to buy me a new pony and tell me that sometimes business relationships don't work out. Even then, I knew marriage was supposed to be more than a business relationship, but I never said so. Pleasing my father was already my life's mission. By the time I was 12, there had been a parade of women through my father's life. Some were kind to me, others ignored me entirely, but none stayed long enough to matter. Until Melania. She arrived at one of my father's infamous summer galas, a vision in white, her accent thick and her smile calculated. I was 16 then, awkward despite my expensive styling, still trying to find my footing in the world of high society that my father navigated so effortlessly. Melania, 15 years my senior, seemed to have been born for it. "You must be Ivanka," she said when we were introduced, her eyes assessing me with cool precision. "Your father talks about you constantly." I doubted that very much, but I smiled politely. "It's nice to meet you. We will be great friends," she declared, though nothing in her tone suggested warmth or affection. "I can teach you many things." 6 months later, she became my stepmother. The wedding was a spectacle of wealth and excess, covered by every magazine and news outlet in the country. I stood beside my father at the altar, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's cars, feeling like a prop in his performance rather than a daughter. "Isn't she beautiful?" my father whispered to me as Melania glided down the aisle. "The most beautiful woman in the world." I nodded, because that's what he wanted, but all I could think was that my mother had once stood where Melania was standing, making the same promises that would eventually be broken. The early years of their marriage coincided with my entry into the business world. Fresh out of the prestigious Wharton School of Business, I was eager to prove myself as more than just the Trench heir. I wanted to build something of my own, to step out from under the enormous shadow my father cast. Melania, meanwhile, was busy transforming herself into the perfect Trench wife. She redecorated our family homes, launched a jewelry line, and became a fixture at charity events. On the surface, we maintained a cordial relationship. In private, the temperature between us dropped well below freezing. "Your skirt is too short for a business meeting," she would say, eyeing my carefully selected outfit. "Men will not take you seriously." Or, "Perhaps you should speak less at dinner. Your father's associates are not interested in a young girl's opinions." Each comment was delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes, always when no one else could hear. I learned to smile back, to thank her for her advice, and then to do exactly as I pleased. It was a subtle war, fought with designer heels and passive-aggressive compliments. My father remained oblivious to the tension, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His focus was always on the next deal, the next acquisition, the next conquest. Draco Trench had built his empire through sheer force of will and a ruthlessness that both terrified and inspired me. I wanted his approval more than anything, and I worked tirelessly to earn it. When he announced his candidacy for the presidency of the United Country, none of us were surprised. Draco had been flirting with politics for years, using his wealth and influence to bend politicians to his will. Why pay them when I can be them, he'd often joke at family dinners. But the joke became reality, and suddenly, our dysfunctional family was thrust into the harshest spotlight imaginable. The campaign was brutal. Every aspect of our lives was scrutinized, every past indiscretion exposed. My father thrived on the chaos, feeding off the energy of his rallies and the devotion of his supporters. Melania played her part perfectly, the poised and elegant potential First Lady. And I found myself in a role I hadn't anticipated, the daughter diplomat. I became the softer face of the Trench campaign, appealing to women voters who were put off by my father's brash persona. I spoke about childcare and workplace equality, trying to steer the conversation toward policies that actually mattered to me. Behind the scenes, the strain was beginning to show. "You're taking up too much space," Melania told me one night after a particularly successful speech I'd given. We were alone in the campaign bus, waiting for my father to finish with the press. "This is not about you." "I'm helping him win," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Isn't that what matters?" She laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "You think you understand politics? You are a child playing in a grown-up world." "I'm 28 years old," I said. "Hardly a child. Age is not the same as wisdom." She smoothed her already perfect hair. "Remember your place, Ivanka. You are the daughter, I am the wife. There is a difference." The hierarchy had been established, and Melania wanted to ensure I understood it. What she didn't realize was that I had a bond with my father that she could never touch. I was his blood, his legacy. In his own way, he loved me. When the election results came in, none of us were prepared for the reality of victory. My father had run almost as a publicity stunt, a way to enhance the Trench brand and settle some old scores. Winning meant actually having to govern, something I'm not sure he had fully considered. The night of the election, I stood on stage beside him, watching the results come in with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. When the final state was called, securing his victory, he turned to me first, not to Melania. "We did it, princess," he said, using the childhood nickname he reserved for private moments. "We showed them all." Melania's smile remained fixed, but her eyes narrowed slightly. In that moment, I knew the real battle was just beginning. Chapter 2: The White Palace. The White Palace was nothing like I had imagined. From the outside, it's an imposing symbol of power and tradition, its white columns and manicured lawns projecting an image of perfect order. Inside, it's a labyrinth of conflicting interests, ancient protocols, and people who have spent their entire careers navigating its treacherous waters. Our arrival was chaotic. My father, never one for tradition, immediately began rearranging everything to suit his taste. Gold fixtures appeared overnight, furniture was swapped out, and staff members who had served for decades were summarily dismissed if they didn't meet his exacting standards. Melania delayed her move to the White Palace, ostensibly to allow my half-brother, Baron, to finish his school year in New York. The press speculated wildly about trouble in their marriage, but I knew the truth. Melania was rewriting her prenuptial agreement, securing her position now that my father had achieved the ultimate power. During those first few months, I found myself in an unprecedented position. With no official First Lady in residence, I was often called upon to fulfill those duties. I hosted foreign dignitaries, attended state dinners, and sat in on meetings that would normally have excluded me. I discovered that I had a talent for diplomacy that my father lacked, and I began to carve out a role for myself as his unofficial advisor. When Melania finally arrived at the White Palace, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. She swept in with an entourage of designers and stylists, immediately reclaiming her territory. "What have you done to the East Wing?" she asked during our first private conversation, her voice cool as she surveyed the changes I'd made to the traditional First Lady's offices. "I've been using it for meetings with various advocacy groups," I explained. "We've been working on a childcare initiative that I think could really make a difference." "How nice," she said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "But of course, this is my space now. You understand." I did understand. I was being evicted, my nascent projects dismantled before they could take root. Melania had no interest in policy or advocacy. She viewed the First Lady role as an extension of her modeling career, a chance to be photographed in designer clothes and make carefully scripted appearances. Rather than fight a losing battle, I established my own office in the West Wing, closer to my father. It was an unprecedented move that caused no small amount of controversy. Nepotism, the press cried. Unqualified, the critics sneered. What they didn't understand was that I was one of the few people my father actually listened to. When he was on the verge of making a catastrophic decision, sometimes I was the only one who could talk him down. My brothers, Drake Jr. and Eric, were too busy running the family business to involve themselves in governance. They were happy to profit from our father's position without taking on any of the responsibility. I couldn't do that. I had seen firsthand how my father's impulsiveness could lead to disaster, and I felt a duty to try to channel his energy in constructive directions. This put me directly in Melania's path. She had expected to be the woman with the most influence over the president, only to find herself sidelined by his daughter. Our Cold War escalated. The first major incident came during a state dinner for the Prime Minister of Japan. I had spent weeks preparing, working with the State Department to ensure every detail was perfect. My father had asked me to take the lead, as trade negotiations with Japan were at a critical juncture. The night of the dinner, I arrived early to check the final arrangements, only to discover that everything had been changed. The seating chart had been rearranged, moving me from my father's table to one at the far end of the room. The menu had been altered to remove dishes I had specifically selected based on the Prime Minister's preferences. Even the flowers had been swapped out. What happened? I asked the head of the household staff, a nervous man who had somehow survived the transition from the previous administration. The First Lady made some adjustments, he said carefully. She felt the original arrangements were not appropriate. I found Melania in the residential quarters, being fitted for her gown. She didn't look up when I entered. You changed everything, I said, keeping my voice level. We had a plan. I am the First Lady, she replied, turning slightly as the seamstress pinned a hem. The state dinner is my responsibility. Dad asked me to handle this one specifically. You know how important these trade negotiations are. She finally looked at me, her eyes cold. And you think you understand international trade better than me? Because you have a business degree that your father bought for you? The seamstress pretended not to hear, focusing intently on her work. This isn't about me, I said. It's about what's best for the country. Melania laughed. Such patriotism. Tell me, Ivanka, when did you become so concerned with the good of the country? Was it before or after it made you important? I felt the familiar sting of her words, but I had learned long ago not to show weakness. I'm going to fix this, I said. The original arrangements were made for a reason. You touch nothing, she said, her accent becoming more pronounced as it always did when she was angry. Or I will tell your father that you are undermining me publicly. How do you think he will react to that? Family loyalty means everything to him. She was right, and we both knew it. My father prized loyalty above all else, and he would see my interference as a betrayal, not of him, but of the family image he had worked so hard to create. The perfect, powerful Trench family, united and unstoppable. I retreated, but I didn't surrender. Throughout the dinner, I worked behind the scenes, whispering in my father's ear between courses, making sure he remembered the key points we had discussed. I smiled at Melania across the table, raised my glass when she was toasted as the gracious hostess. And all the while, I plotted my next move. The Japanese trade deal was successfully negotiated, despite Melania's interference. My father credited me privately, but publicly praised his beautiful wife for creating the perfect atmosphere for diplomacy. I didn't care about the credit, I cared about the results. This became our pattern. Melania controlled the superficial aspects of White Palace life, the decor, the social calendar, the public image, while I worked on substance. I built relationships with key legislators, foreign diplomats, and business leaders. I championed causes that I genuinely cared about, even when they put me at odds with my father's official positions. The press couldn't decide what to make of me. To some, I was a feminist icon, navigating a male-dominated world with poise and intelligence. To others, I was a privileged princess, unelected and unaccountable. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Melania and I maintained a facade of unity in public. We posed for photos together, complimented each other in interviews, and presented a united front at official functions. Behind closed doors, we circled each other like wary predators, always watching for signs of weakness. The staff learned to navigate our complicated dynamic. There were Melania people and Ivanka people, and the two rarely mixed. Information flowed along separate channels, meetings were scheduled to avoid conflict, and decisions were made in parallel universes that occasionally collided with spectacular results. One such collision occurred during the planning of the annual White Palace Easter celebration, traditionally the First Lady's event. Melania had delegated most of the planning to her staff, showing little interest in the details beyond approving the designer for her outfit. I saw an opportunity and stepped in, working with the event team to create educational activities for the children and inviting a diverse group of families from across the country. 2 days before the event, Melania discovered the extent of my involvement. She summoned me to her office, a sleek, minimalist space that reflected her aesthetic. "What is this?" she demanded, gesturing to the event schedule. "Science experiments? Diversity panels? This is an Easter egg roll, not a political rally." "It's the modern age," I replied. "We can celebrate tradition while also providing meaningful experiences for the children." "You are pushing your agenda using my event," she said. "Always you do this, inserting yourself where you do not belong." "I'm trying to make a difference," I said. "Isn't that what we're here for?" She laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "You still don't understand. We are here because your father wanted to win. The power, the prestige, that is what matters to him. Not making a difference." "You're wrong about him," I said, though a part of me wondered if she was right. "And you're wrong about me." "Am I?" She studied me with those cool, assessing eyes. "You want everyone to believe you are so different from him, but you are not. You have his ambition, his ruthlessness. The only difference is that you hide it better." Her words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. I had spent my life trying to balance my father's influence with my own values, never quite sure where one ended and the other began. "The event goes forward as planned," I said finally. "Dad has already approved it." It was a power move, using my father's authority to override her objections. I rarely played that card, but when I did, it was devastating. Melania's face hardened, but she said nothing more. I had won that round, but I knew there would be consequences. The Easter celebration was a success, garnering positive press coverage and praise from education advocates. Melania performed her duties flawlessly, smiling for the cameras and reading a story to the children with practiced charm. Beneath the gilded facade, the Ivanka Trench story. Chapter 3, The Breaking Point. The third year of my father's presidency marked a turning point. The initial chaos had settled into a strange new normal, but beneath the surface, tensions were building. The country was more divided than ever, with protests becoming a regular occurrence outside the White Palace gates. Inside, our family's own fractures were beginning to show. My father's Twitter storms had become more erratic, his decisions more impulsive. The staff turnover rate was unprecedented: 5 communications directors in 3 years, 3 chiefs of staff, countless advisors who either quit or were fired via social media. I found myself spending more time putting out fires than advancing any meaningful policy. "You need to rest," I told him one night, having been summoned to the Oval Office at 2 a.m. to discuss a perceived slight from a foreign diplomat. "You're making decisions while exhausted." He waved away my concern, his eyes fixed on the television where commentators dissected his latest controversial statement. "I've never needed much sleep." Weakness, needing sleep. The body knows what it needs. "Even you have limits," I said gently. "The stress of this job." "There's no stress," he snapped, his face flushing. "I'm doing great, everyone says so. Perfect job, perfect presidency." I recognized the signs of his anger building and changed tactics. Of course you are. I just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself. The country needs you at your best. His expression softened slightly. You're a good daughter, Ivanka. The best. Not like some people around here who just want to use me. I knew he was referring to his cabinet, most of whom he now viewed with suspicion. The circle of people he trusted had shrunk dramatically, and I was one of the few remaining inside it. It was a position that gave me power but also trapped me in a role I hadn't chosen. Later that week, a major policy crisis erupted over immigration. My father's hardline stance had always made me uncomfortable, but his latest proposal, to separate children from their parents at the border as a deterrent, crossed a line I couldn't ignore. I had built my personal brand around supporting women and families. To remain silent would be to sacrifice whatever credibility I had left. I scheduled a private meeting with him, away from the advisors who tended to inflame his worst instincts. Dad, we need to talk about this family separation policy, I began, sitting across from him in the residence. The optics are terrible. Optics, he scoffed. Who cares about optics? This is about security, about showing strength. It's about children, I countered. Young kids being traumatized. As a mother, I can't support this. And neither can most of the country. You're bleeding hard again, he said, but I could tell he was listening. What would you suggest instead? This was how I'd learned to influence him, not by direct opposition, but by offering alternatives that allowed him to save face. We spent an hour discussing different approaches that would address border security without the cruelty of family separation. By the end, he was claiming the new ideas as his own, but I didn't care. Results mattered more than credit. The next morning, I was summoned to Melania's office. She rarely initiated contact with me, so I knew something significant had happened. You went behind my back, she said without preamble, standing by the window that overlooked the rose garden. The immigration policy. I was confused. I spoke with my father about an issue I care about. How is that going behind your back? She turned, her expression tight with anger. I have been working on this for weeks. My office was preparing a statement, meetings were arranged with officials. Then you come in at the last minute and take over. I had no idea you were involved, I said honestly. Dad never mentioned it. Of course he didn't. Her laugh was bitter. Why would he tell you that his wife also cares about children? That doesn't fit the narrative you've created. For the first time, I saw something beyond the cold calculation in her eyes, genuine hurt. It occurred to me that perhaps Melania and I had more in common than I'd allowed myself to believe. We were both women trying to carve out meaning in the shadow of an overwhelming personality. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. We should be working together on these issues, not against each other. She studied me for a long moment, as if assessing my sincerity. Perhaps, she said finally. But trust must be earned, Ivanka. And there is little trust between us. She was right. Years of subtle warfare had eroded any foundation for collaboration. But the immigration crisis was bigger than our personal animosity. Let's start now, I suggested. A joint initiative. Your platform is Be Best, focused on children's well-being. Mine is workforce development and family support. There's natural overlap, especially when it comes to these separated families. I could see her weighing the political advantages against her instinctive distrust of me. Finally, she nodded. A joint statement first. Then we see. It was a small step, but a significant one. The joint statement received positive coverage, presenting a united front that surprised both the press and my father. For once, the women in his life were making headlines for cooperation rather than competition. Our tentative alliance was soon tested by an unexpected crisis. Reports emerged of my father's involvement with a film actress years before, complete with financial payoffs to keep the story quiet. The scandal threatened to derail key legislation and dominated every news cycle. Melania retreated from public view, her silence speaking volumes. The press speculated wildly about the state of their marriage, photographers camped outside the White Palace hoping to catch a glimpse of separate bedrooms or tears. I found her one evening in the music room, sitting alone in the dark. She didn't acknowledge me when I entered, her gaze fixed on the shadowy garden beyond the windows. "I'm sorry," I said, because there was nothing else to say. "For what?" Her voice was flat. "This is nothing new." The resignation in her tone hit me harder than anger would have. I knew my father's history with women, the affairs, the objectification, the casual disregard for marital vows. I had spent a lifetime making excuses for him, rationalizing his behavior, focusing on his better qualities. But seeing Melania's quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation made those excuses ring hollow. "It shouldn't be this way," I said, sitting beside her. "No," she agreed. "But it is. And we both chose this life, Ivanka. You by birth, me by marriage. No one forced us to stay." Her words resonated uncomfortably. Why had I stayed? Why had I tied my reputation, my future, to a man whose values often clashed so dramatically with my own professed beliefs? The answer was both simple and complex. He was my father, and I loved him despite everything. "What will you do?" I asked. She turned to look at me, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "I will do what I have always done. I will survive." In that moment, a strange understanding passed between us. We were not friends, too much history and hurt stood between us for that, but we were allies in a battle to maintain our dignity in an undignified situation. The scandal eventually faded, as all scandals do in the relentless churn of White Palace drama. But its effects lingered, reshaping the dynamics of our strange family. Melania established clearer boundaries with my father, spending more time on her own initiatives and less on performing the traditional First Lady role. And I found myself increasingly questioning my place in an administration whose actions often contradicted my stated values. Chapter 4: The Reckoning. The final year of my father's term brought a series of crises that tested us all. A global pandemic, economic collapse, civil unrest, each day brought new challenges that exposed the fundamental weaknesses in my father's leadership style. His need for adoration clashed with public health guidance, his impulsiveness undermined coordinated response efforts, his inability to express empathy alienated a suffering nation. I threw myself into crisis management, working with task forces and business leaders to coordinate aid efforts. Melania, surprisingly, emerged as a calm voice of reason, promoting health guidelines even when my father undermined them. We found ourselves allied not just by circumstance but by a shared determination to mitigate the damage. The re-election campaign loomed over everything, my father increasingly desperate to secure a second term. The polls showed him trailing, and his response was to double down on the divisive rhetoric that had defined his presidency. "You need to reach beyond your base," I told him during a strategy session. "The hardcore supporters aren't enough to win. The silent majority is with me," he insisted. "They just don't talk to pollsters." "Then we need to give them something to be vocal about," I urged. "Positive achievements, plans for economic recovery, anything besides attacking opponents." He dismissed my concerns with a wave. "Stick to your women's issues, princess. Leave the campaign strategy to me." It was the first time he had so explicitly diminished my input, and it stung. After years of being the smart one, the trusted advisor, I was being relegated to a traditional female role, pretty, supportive, and silent. I realized with sudden clarity that my influence had always been conditional on my agreement. The moment I challenged his fundamental approach, the facade of respect crumbled. Melania saw the change immediately. "Now you understand," she said when she found me staring out the window of my West Wing office. "There is only room for one star in his universe, and it is never us." "I thought I was different," I admitted. "His daughter, his blood. We are all replaceable to him," she said without bitterness, simply stating a fact. "The sooner you accept this, the freer you will be." But acceptance didn't come easily. I had built my identity around being Ivanka Trench, the daughter who could influence the most powerful man in the world. Who was I without that? As the election approached, I campaigned tirelessly, still hoping that my father might listen to reason if we secured a second term. But privately, I began planning for a future beyond the White Palace. I reconnected with old business contacts, explored opportunities that had nothing to do with the Trench name, and spent more time thinking about the legacy I wanted to build for myself and my children. Election night was a blur of conflicting emotions. As the results came in showing my father's defeat, I felt an expected sadness, but also, I can admit it now, a sense of relief. The constant pressure, the moral compromises, the public scrutiny would finally end. We could return to some version of normal life. My father, predictably, refused to accept defeat. The weeks that followed tested my loyalty like never before as he made increasingly desperate claims of fraud and conspiracy. I tried to be the voice of reason, to guide him toward a graceful concession, but he was beyond my influence. The final break came in January, during the certification of the electoral votes. My father's rhetoric had inflamed his supporters to the point of violence, and I watched in horror as they stormed the Capitol, threatening the very foundation of our democracy. "You need to call them off," I pleaded, finding him watching the chaos unfold on television. "Tell them to go home peacefully. People could die. They're fighting for me," he said, a strange smile playing on his lips. Finally, someone's fighting for me. In that moment, I saw him clearly, not as the larger-than-life father I had idolized, not as the powerful president I had served, but as a man so consumed by his own ego that he would risk the country's stability rather than admit defeat. "This isn't about loyalty anymore," I said quietly. "This is about right and wrong." He looked at me with sudden coldness. "Sounds like something a traitor would say." That word, traitor, cut through the last threads of my illusions. I had given everything to support him, compromised my values, defended the indefensible, all out of love and loyalty. And in the end, it meant nothing if I wouldn't follow him into the abyss. I left the room without another word, knowing that our relationship would never be the same. In the residence, I found Melania supervising the packing of their personal items, her face impassive as she watched the news coverage. "It's over," I said simply. She nodded, unsurprised. "For him, perhaps. But not for you, not for me. We must think of the future now." "What future?" I asked bitterly. "The Trench name is toxic. Half the country hates us, the other half expects things we can't deliver. Then we build something new," she said with unexpected resolve. "Without his shadow over us. It is time, Ivanka." She was right. For too long, I had defined myself in relation to my father, his daughter, his advisor, his defender. The end of his presidency offered a chance to discover who I was without those roles. The transition was not easy. My father refused to attend the inauguration, departing the White Palace with characteristic drama. I chose to attend, a decision that created the final rupture in our relationship. 4 months afterward, we didn't speak at all. Epilogue: The Woman in the Mirror. 2 years have passed since I walked out of the White Palace for the last time. The journey since has been one of painful self-discovery and reinvention. My marriage, strained by years of White Palace pressure, nearly collapsed in the aftermath. Jared and I had to learn how to be partners again, not just fellow soldiers in my father's army. We moved away from New York, seeking anonymity and simplicity in a quieter life. Professionally, I disbanded my fashion brand and stepped back from the Trench organization. Instead, I focused on targeted philanthropic work, supporting women entrepreneurs in developing countries, far from the political spotlight, making a difference without making headlines. My relationship with my father remains complicated. We speak occasionally, usually on holidays or birthdays, our conversations carefully avoiding any mention of politics or the past. He has never apologized for the "I traitor" comment, nor have I asked him to. Some wounds are too deep for simple healing. Surprisingly, Melania and I have maintained contact. Our shared experience created a bond that transcends our former rivalry. She too has rebuilt her life, establishing a foundation for children's wellness that reflects her genuine concerns rather than political calculation. We are not friends in the traditional sense, but there is a mutual respect that would have seemed impossible during our White Palace years. Last month, I was invited to speak at a women's leadership conference. As I prepared my remarks, I realized how rarely I speak publicly these days. The constant exposure of White Palace life gave way to a cherished privacy, a chance to think without having every word dissected by critics and supporters alike. Standing at the podium, I looked out at a sea of women who had come not to see the Trench heir or the former first daughter, but to hear from someone who had learned difficult lessons about power, compromise, and finding her own voice. For most of my life, I believed that influence was the same as integrity. That if I could shape decisions from the inside, it didn't matter what I had to sacrifice to keep my seat at the table. I was wrong. The speech wasn't about my father or politics, it was about the universal challenge of staying true to yourself in a world that constantly asks you to bend. For the first time, I spoke without calculation, without considering how my words would affect the family brand or political alliances. I simply told the truth as I had lived it. Afterward, a young woman approached me, clutching a notebook. "I used to hate you," she said bluntly. "I thought you were complicit in everything." I nodded, having heard this before. Many people did. Sometimes I was. "But then you chose differently," she continued. "You chose integrity over loyalty. That's what I want to ask you about. How do you know when it's time to walk away?" It was a profound question, one I'm still answering for myself. "You feel it," I told her. "There's a moment when staying quiet costs more than speaking up. When the person you see in the mirror becomes someone you don't recognize." As I drove home that evening, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The marble floors of Trench Tower seemed a lifetime away, as did the corridors of the White Palace. I had been the princess in the tower, the daughter diplomat, the reluctant accomplice. Now, finally, I was simply Ivanka, still learning, still growing, but authentically myself. The gilded facade had cracked, revealing something more genuine beneath. And for that, despite all the pain and loss, I am grateful. The end.